Okay, today's lecture covers early peoples of the Gulf of Mexico. The goals for today's lecture are to cover prehistoric culture in the Gulf of Mexico, mound building cultures, tribes in the northern Gulf of Mexico, and early coastal cultures around the world. The learning goals for today are to understand that Native Americans in the coastal Gulf of Mexico had healthy, complex societies, largely without agriculture. That prehistoric Gulf cultures were highly skilled at engineering earthworks that can stand up to the region's unique climate. That a number of tribes have inhabited the Gulf of Mexico region, both historically and today. And that prehistoric coastal cultures around the world had unique ties to the sea. So to understand the uniqueness of the early Gulf of Mexico cultures, the first thing I need to cover is the link between complex society and agriculture. Typically, when we look at complex societies, early civilization, or this complexness that is inherent in early societies, and the ability to do agriculture, these go hand in hand. And the reason for that is if food supply is managed by a few people or the farmers, that means not everyone needs to devote their full time to obtaining food as they would in a hunter-gatherer type society. And this allows for specialized jobs such as textile production, leadership roles, these kinds of things. Farming also leads to owning land, which leads to a hierarchical society or different classes. You have landowners, and then you have people that are not landowners, and so that inherently introduces some classes. Disputes over land and distribution of resources leads to stronger leadership and laws. If you have disputes, you need to have someone that's able to weigh in on these, and so we have leadership that's strengthened in terms of its role in the culture, and the possibility of having some sort of legal system in place to deal with these disputes. If you're farming, then it makes sense that settlements become permanent and can produce goods that can be traded. You have these specialized jobs, and so you're producing things that can be traded. And settlements then become linked in a trading network. And so these are all things that are thought to be inherent of an agricultural-based society. All of these being levels of complexity or the addition of complexity when a society switches to agriculture. In the Gulf of Mexico, however, we have evidence of healthy, highly complex societies, largely without the assistance of agriculture. Essentially, we have a complex hunter-gatherer society in the Gulf of Mexico. And so most of this talk is going to be associated with explaining how or why that might have happened here to make this region unique. And first, we have to take a look at some of the prehistoric indigenous inhabitants of the coastal Gulf of Mexico to fully understand the reasons behind this. So the early prehistoric indigenous Native Americans in the region were mound builders. And so this is a culture of people that left behind mounds. You can see here in this image the location of a variety of mounds in southeastern Louisiana, this being the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River Delta. These mound building cultures were not confined to this region, so they built extensive earthworks all the way from the Great Lakes down through the Mississippi River Valley and into the Gulf of Mexico region. These mounds are thought to be for religious, ceremonial, burial, and elite residential purposes. The mounds are dated from 3500 BC to 1000 AD, and so it's hard to tell how old that is without some context. But 3500 BC would be predating the pyramids of Egypt. So these are indeed quite old structures. And unlike the pyramids of Egypt, these were built without the help of animals or wheels. And so these were entirely a human effort, which I think makes them all the more impressive. So to give you an example of one of the sites where this mound building occurred, this is an artist's rendition of the Watson Brake mound site, which is located in northern Louisiana here. Watson Brake is the site of the oldest known earthwork mound complex in North America. And so this site is 3,500 BC, is approximately 3,500 BC, which makes it over 5,000 years old, which makes it older than the Egyptian pyramids. This site is thought to have been developed over centuries by a complex hunter-gatherer society. Um, and understanding that this was not a society that was based in agriculture, but instead a complex society of hunter-gatherers really changed the way that archaeologists thought about hunter-gatherer society. So this was not a stationary culture. This was a culture that was nomadic in form, but somehow able to organize a workforce that was able to construct this complex over centuries. So that's a highly complex level of society that was inherent in this nomadic hunter-gatherer society. And kind of threw archaeologists for a loop when they discovered it. Watson Brake, that location may have been used as a base by mobile hunter-gatherers from summer through fall. So we don't have evidence of year-round occupation at that site. Instead, what they're able to find is fish and plants that are common in the summer and fall. And so that's the thought, is that this was used as a location to, seasonally. And interestingly, the mounds look as if they were built in stages. And over time, these stages, if we were to map them on a timeline, they coincide with periods of increased frequency of El Nino Southern Oscillation events. So these would be ENSO events. And I'm pretty sure that all of you have covered this in your Intro to Oceanography course. Just as a reminder for this region, for the Gulf of Mexico, for coastal southern United States, El Nino means we get cool, wet weather, and La Nina means we get warm, dry weather. And so it's thought that with these increased frequencies of switches between these cool, damp times and warm, dry times, that building these mounds may have been a communal response to the stresses of having increased frequency of droughts and increased frequency of flooding. And these may have resulted in an unpredictable food base that brought people together to work on these communal areas, such as the Watson Brake site. And I want to dig a little bit more into this changes of ENSO frequency idea, but this is advanced material, so your honors students are going to be responsible for this. But otherwise, you just might be interested in learning that over the timescale of millennia, the frequency of El Nino Southern Oscillation events changes. So this image here is showing you events, switches between El Nino and La Nina per 100 years over time, whereas 0 is current day, and then this goes further and further into the past. You can see that sometimes we get a lot of events per 100 years, and sometimes we get hardly any. And the reason for that is changes in ENSO are a response to changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun. So the Earth orbiting around the sun doesn't happen in a perfect circular motion. It actually occurs as a sphere, as an ellipse, so as a stretched out circle. And so that means that there are certain times when the Earth passes closer to the sun as it travels around the sun over the course of a year. In current day, what we have is the Earth passes closest to the sun in the fall and in the spring. And it's furthest away from the sun in the summer. And it turns out that when the Earth is in this configuration, when it passes closest to the sun in the spring and the fall, we have increased frequency of ENSO events, which means we get more frequent oscillations between El Nino and La Nina events. And it's thought that when Watson Brake, the mound site, was built, It was in response to a period of time when the people had to deal with an increased frequency in El Nino events, right around 5,000 years ago. The Watson break culture over time produced many other cultures that are we have evidence for in this region. And the slightly more modern version of the Watson break culture is actually the Poverty Point culture. And so the Poverty Point peoples were likely the first tribal culture in the region, and they inhabited the lower Mississippi River Valley and Gulf Coast approximately 1730 to 1350 BC. So this would be a few thousand years after the earliest evidence of mound building, so Watson break. And they left behind more than 100 mound complexes that form the evidence for a large trading network spanning throughout the eastern United States. A mound complex looks something like this. This is an artist's rendition of what the Poverty Point World Heritage Site looks like. So this is in Louisiana. And then this is what it looks like from the sky. There's no evidence that Poverty Point peoples were farmers, so they likely did not engage in agriculture. These people, there is evidence that they were hunter-gatherers like the Watson Break people. So how did mound building cultures develop these healthy, complex societies, largely without agriculture? How were they able to do this when we thought that agriculture was a prerequisite for complex society? The idea is that the Gulf of Mexico provided a lot of coastal resources. So they lived with a subsistence economy that was based on plentiful wild coastal resources. Food was abundant enough that people didn't have to go and forage all the time. They were able to have specialized jobs because they didn't have to go out looking for food all the time. And because there was so much food, there's actually a seasonal surplus of food. And that seasonal surplus, together with the trade goods that were created throughout the year, could be used to trade. So a trade network would form. In addition, instead of having a bunch of individual families that were nomadic and relatively separated, you had this concept of seasonal shifts in resources and also coastal threats such as flooding or droughts that would bring individuals together for support in building these mound complexes, for instance. And so dealing with threats likely needed some strong leadership, and coming together regularly likely resulted in strong community ties and even monument building like the mounds that we see today. So it was an abundance of resources and an abundance of threats from living in a coastal environment that was able to form this complex society of people that were hunter-gatherers and not farmers. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a quiz. So go ahead and hop on Top Hat.